Welcome to Radio Vision Network. Bill Moore here with another segment of History for My Grandchildren. Last week we talked about the other crossing down at Dunks Ferry, which is now Beverly. Today I want to finish up the story with Washington's improbable victory at Trenton. And by the end of this segment you'll see that the victory was not so improbable. I want to recap the preparations for this. Washington and his generals had talked about this for days, weeks. They knew that something had to be done quickly, and something had to be done out of the ordinary. Something to snatch victory from defeat. It looked like the new American Revolution had run out of steam. After the disastrous defeats in and around the city of New York and the retreat down and across New Jersey, the Continental Army was basically on its last legs. Washington had fewer than 3,500 effective troops left. Yes, there were troops in other states, other than the 13 colonies, but nothing like Washington's Continental Army existed. Their enlistments would soon run out. So we had to do something. He had to do something. Washington, his generals and his men had to do something to keep this American Revolution alive. Now I want to recap the hazards of the crossing, the ordeal of the crossing. North of Trenton, where Washington crossed at McConkey's Ferry, the river was not as wide. The river was only about 800 feet wide, but it was still a bitterly cold night. It was still raining, sleeting, snowing. There was a horrible wind, there were ice flows in the river, and it was a long, drawn-out ordeal most of the night. Now I want you to remember something. These men had been drawn up on the Pennsylvania shore since late in the afternoon. Started assembling before dark. It took the night, almost the entire night, for Washington's army, or Washington's part of the army, to be ferried across at McConkey's. Here they are, men in summer uniforms, men in uniforms that had holes, not enough patches to cover the holes, men that didn't have boots, men that didn't have gloves, men that didn't have shoes at all, wrapped their feet in blankets and in rags. And here they are forming up on the New Jersey shore. Now they had the task. They had gotten across, but their ordeal had only just begun. They had to march south to Trenton. They had to do so under strict orders not to make noise in the ranks, not to alert the surrounding countryside. That's pretty hard to do when you have 18 artillery pieces, you have horses, and you have about 2,000, 2,500 troops, to not make any noise. But they were as quiet as they possibly could be. Many of these men had faced defeat, had been defeated in and around New York, had been on the long retreat across New Jersey. They had escaped to the Pennsylvania shore. However, there were troops that hadn't been involved in these defeats, and a new spirit was starting to permeate the army. These men knew that they had to do or die. This was the last gasp of a revolution. If they didn't succeed here, the revolution in effect would be over. Here they are. They're formed up on the New Jersey shore. They're marching south under bitter, bitter cold conditions. So cold that at least one officer was overcome by the coldness, fell out of the line of march, stumbled to the ground, and lay there in a stupor. He would have died of exposure. He would have frozen to death that night. But later, troops in the column stumbled over his body, roused him up, picked him up, and he continued the line of march. Matter of fact, he tried to hurry forward to catch up with his own regiment. Here they go on the march south. They get about halfway there. They get to a little crossroads known as Birmingham. Now it's still dark. It's still bitterly cold. The storm is continuing unabated. They stop. They need something to eat. They had pre-cooked rations, okay? Not much of anything, all right? But they had what they called fire cakes. They had a little bit of water, and if they were smart, in their wooden canteens, they mixed the water with a local concoction, Applejack, Jersey Lightning. The Applejack kept their water in the canteens from freezing. This was what they had to eat that cold, bitterly cold morning. And then they continued on the march south. At that little crossroad of Birmingham, they still had 5 more miles to go. Somewhere about a total of 10 miles overall after they made the ferry crossing at McConkey's Ferry. Now, the good thing, there was no buildup on the New Jersey side of ice, so they didn't have any trouble unloading horses. They didn't have any trouble unloading the artillery. Here they go. But something they didn't face down at Dunk's Ferry, there were a couple creeks in the way, the road that they had to go. One of these creeks had a very, very steep ravine. It had cut its banks down. They had to scramble down that steep ravine, scramble up the other side after they went through the icy cold waters of the creek. Not only that, they had artillery, 18 artillery pieces. Each artillery piece had to be manhandled down that creek and manhandled across. These artillery pieces weighed no less than 1,000 pounds apiece. They had to unhitch the horses. They had to lead them across and then rehitch the horses. This was done several different times during that night march. We're breaking now for a commercial. I'll be right back.
Love my style, I'm dancing tonight. It's my smile from pearly white side. Love myself, love myself, love my style, pearly white. Love your smile, from teens to grown-ups faces. They can change your life, all ages and all faces. It's your smile from pearly white. Love yourself, love your style, pearly white. Love your smile.
This is the second half of what I started last week. We talked about the other crossing down at Dunk's Ferry. This is the main crossing at McConkey's Ferry and the attack and victory at Trenton. We're at the crossroads of Birmingham. The troops are eating their meager breakfast of pre-cooked salt pork and fire cakes, washed down with a little water and maybe a little fire water, a little Jersey Applejack. All right, now they continue down towards Trenton. One of the advantages they had in their ranks men who lived in the area. Captain John Mott lived on the New Jersey side. He lived on the way to Trenton. I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't pass his own house on the way to the attack at Trenton. So they had the advantage of local knowledge of the terrain. Fortunately, it seems they weren't spotted. Although the popular conception of Trenton was that the Hessians were all in their warm houses, they were celebrating Christmas, they were drunk, they were this, they were that. That's not the case. Later historians have looked at all the circumstances, all the records that we have. By contrast, the Hessians were on high alert. They had been warned that something was going on the Pennsylvania side. They had been warned of an imminent attack. Matter of fact, a Pennsylvania farmer, a Tory farmer, had even crossed the river and delivered a handwritten note to Colonel Rawl, who was in charge of the Hessians at Trenton. Unfortunately for us, the note was written in English, and Colonel Rawl could not read English. He folded it, put it in his pocket, and there it lay. The Hessians had been on high alert for 3 nights previously. Matter of fact, they had taken the unusual tactic of sleeping in full uniform with cartridge belts buckled, everything at the ready. And they had also instituted patrols around Trenton that started at 4 o'clock in the morning. So to say that they were not prepared, to say that this was a complete surprise is just not so. Washington did have an edge, though. Washington had a considerable edge, and historians today are only now realizing that. One of the edges that he had was the esprit de corps and the professionalism of his soldiers, the common soldier. They were tired of being defeated. They were tired of having to run away, regroup, and then go back again. They knew that they were up against the best soldiers in the world. These Hessians were professional soldiers that the British had hired, and they were very, very good at what they did. But these men, these new Americans, had resolved that this day, this night, this morning, they would not be beaten. They knew what they had to do. The other thing in their favor, which historians have not counted upon, haven't looked at very closely, was the fact that the Hessians too were suffering from the winter weather, and probably less prepared for this ill winter weather than the American troops. They too were in summer uniforms. Some of those had their shoes and their boots worn out, so they weren't very good out in the snow. How would you like to go out in the snow with worn or no boots and with a summer uniform on, your shorts and your t-shirt, so to speak? But here they were. Washington also had the advantage in that he had riflemen. He had a lot of very good riflemen. These riflemen were as good or better shots than the best of the Hessian Jaegers, and their weapons far outranged the Hessian muskets. So they had this in their favor. Something else that Washington did, he took a tactic out of Frederick the great Prussian leader, by bringing along all of his artillery. He brought 18 pieces of artillery. And you think, why would you bring so much in a night sneak attack? Well, we're going to find out in a short while. At this time, we're going to break for a commercial, and I'll be right back with the improbable victory at Trenton.
High-achieving students, internationally renowned faculty, and award-winning alumni. A 226-year history of excellence and a beautiful urban campus. The University of Pittsburgh.
Miles from Birmingham to the outskirts of Trenton. Washington's troops are coming in on the north end of Trenton. It's a commanding height overlooking the city of Trenton. Trenton is situated in a bowl. 2 streets that go directly north-south right into Trenton. Most of the houses are abandoned. Many houses, Hessian troops are quartered. Washington has achieved the surprise. Yes, there's a little bit of firing. There are some Hessian pickets on the outskirts, the northern outskirts, and they're pushed right out of the way by Washington's oncoming troops. Washington quickly sets up his artillery. The artillery commands Trenton itself. All right, the Hessians are aroused. One of Rawl's adjutants knew must have been a sixth sense or something. He knew something was up. He had tried for 2 hours to get Colonel Rawl out of the house and get him ready. Well, with the sound of Washington's first artillery fire, he succeeds in arousing Colonel Rawl. Colonel Rawl is a professional soldier with over 30 years experience. He's in his 50s, so he's been a soldier all his life. He's out quickly, he rouses his troops. Troops come pouring out of the houses. Remember, they've slept in full uniform. They've slept with their cartridge belts on. They have their weapons. They're assembling in the street. But Washington has got the advantage. He's got long range for the time artillery, able to fire right down into town. Rawl assembles his regiment, starts to assemble it on King Street. Washington is up at the top beyond King Street, looking right down into the street. The Americans pour artillery fire down. They continue to pour artillery fire down. They've got cannonballs, solid shot, that they can fire right down the street. And they can bounce those cannonballs, and they do their deadly work as they come bounding down the street. It's like a bowling alley. It's like a bowling lane. Here come these cannonballs down the street, playing havoc with the Hessian troops assembling in the street. Washington also has artillery shells exploding over the Hessians. These shells explode and rain down shrapnel. So it's a pretty hectic scene. Rawl, because of the military discipline of his Hessians, is able to assemble them. He assembles his regiment of grenadiers. They fix bayonets, and they use the tried and true tactic of the Hessians, a bayonet attack right up King Street. Washington has anticipated this, as have his gunners. They have plenty of grape and canister shot. This turns these cannons into huge shotguns, and they do terrible damage to the onrushing Hessian troops. Even disciplined Hessian professional soldiers have to break and run under the carnage that is wreaked on them in King Street. So they're breaking and running. Americans have now a double pincer movement that's enveloped the city. There are American riflemen in many of these abandoned houses. They pour in rifle fire from all sides. Some Hessians break and run, as does the British light cavalry. They bail out of Trenton by the back door, and they head south towards Bordentown. But the remaining Hessians again are rallied by Rawl. The 2nd Regiment, and even more elite than his grenadiers, they charge up King Street. They too are decimated. Rawl is wounded, and one of the ironies of this battle, the unofficial surrender of Rawl is accepted by his first cousin, an officer in a Maryland Continental Regiment, a Hessian who has immigrated to America and is part of the army opposing him. The Hessians were quite surprised that there were many Germans among Washington's Continental troops, although overall 40% of Washington's troops were Irish and Scotch-Irish. Why do I mention that? Well, they had a few scores to settle with the British, and this made their attack all the more powerful. As Washington sees that Rawl's grenadiers have been decimated, he sees that the other regiment of Hessians has been decimated. He now sends a concentrated American infantry attack right down King Street. And one of the men who led that attack was a lieutenant by the name of James Monroe. That's right, a future president of the United States. These Virginians rush headlong down the street, firing as they go, and remember, their long rifles outrange the Hessians' muskets. While down in the city itself, you've got riflemen who have muskets, and instead of using one ball and taking a long time to load, they used buck and ball, which is a load of 1 projectile and 4 or 5 buckshot. At close range, this proves deadly. This fire is decimating the Hessians from the side. And in just a few hours, the battle is over. Washington has won an improbable victory, but a victory that his men, the men in the ranks, the men that fought this battle, knew had to be won. What did it mean for the new American nation? It meant that this new American nation would fight on until 5 years later at Yorktown, the Americans and their French allies stood to arms as the British surrendered and marched out of Yorktown, and the revolution was over. It was this improbable victory at Trenton that caused the revolution to continue, that caused the new American nation to live to fight another day. This is what Trenton meant, and this is what Trenton should mean to all Americans. This was what made possible our country. So it wasn't so much of an improbable victory. Washington had the advantage of surprise. European troops didn't fight in the dark, they didn't fight in bad weather, they didn't fight in the wintertime. So they didn't expect an all-out attack. Washington used their own tactics against them. He read up, he knew intimately the tactics of Frederick the great Prussian leader, the great German leader. So it looked like an improbable victory, but when you start taking it apart and looking at it, it wasn't so improbable. All the pieces fell into place. Washington won a remarkable victory, an almost textbook victory. Washington had finally learned his lessons. This is Bill Moore for History with My Grandchildren, and this is the story for the ages. This is the story for the American nation. This is the story that happened this time of year. So tomorrow, when it's bitterly cold outside, think of those young Americans that made possible our country. Look forward to seeing you again next week with History for My Grandchildren. This is Bill Moore on Radio Vision Network. Thanks for watching.
Solano Community College transformed my life.
And gave me the opportunities I needed to succeed.
I received the same university-caliber education.
Without the pressures of debt holding me back. Affordable and flexible. I fulfilled my undergraduate classes.
Getting to the information I truly have a passion for.
The decision to attend SCC empowered my future.
And made my dream of attending